name is Mikiala, and I have the privilege of working with our discipleship ministry and our student ministry. And I was excited to be here today because one of my favorite authors and speakers, his name is John Acuff, and he deems the Sunday after Christmas as Happy Youth Pastor Preaching the Sermon Day, because typically in churches all across America at this point, it's the youth pastor who's up there because the senior pastor is on vacation. So we're thankful that Pastor Jeff gets to get away with his family, and I'm thankful to be here with you guys. So Happy New Year's Eve. I know that as we kind of bring 2017 to a close and look forward to 2018, as a people we generally get very retrospective. We start thinking about the resolutions that maybe we didn't quite keep at the beginning of the year, but then we think about the things that we did accomplish, and we can find joy and excitement in that. Maybe the things that were left undone that we have to put off until the future in the coming year. And we think about all those things because we as a people, we're so busy. We have all these things that we do. We work, we play, we love, we learn, we laugh, we cry, we worship, and then we pretend to get some rest, and then we do it all over again. You know, that's just what we do as a culture. But in all of that, all of those things, we call ourselves living. You know, this is what makes up life and all of the things that we do. But one of the things that I want to focus in on a little bit today is what is truly living? What does that really mean? And how does that fit in our lives today? And we're going to look at the Apostle Paul and what he has to say in Acts about that a little bit. Now see, in chapter 17 of Acts, Paul was traveling all over to different places, and he was preaching about the gospel. So he's telling different people about Jesus. So we see him travel to visit the Thessalonian people. We see him travel to visit the people of Berea. And then finally, in chapter 17, we see him end in Greece. So what happens when he gets to Greece is he's in Athens, and he's looking around at the culture and the community, and he gets convicted because he sees that these people are worshiping all of these different idols, and they have all these temples built to these different idols. And so what Paul tries to do, he gets convicted in his heart. He's like, man, I really have to tell these people about the good news of Jesus. And so he goes and he reasons with the Jewish people in the synagogue. And then he goes to the local marketplace, and he's talking to all the people there in the community. He's trying to help them understand who God truly is. And so the people in the community, they notice that he's this guy who's kind of stirring up all this stuff because he's talking about this new God that they've never heard of. And so what the people of the community do is they take him to this low hill, and where this hill was, it's where they had kind of the supreme court of their day. So this is the place where people would gather, and they would try people for crimes and see, you know, if you were right or if you were in the wrong. And so they would get to this place, and they would hold court, and they would try to decipher what was true and what was not. So there's a lot of significance here that they bring Paul to this place. They set him on this low hill so that he can speak, and they question him, and they say, okay, Paul, what is this new God that you're talking about? We don't know what it is. And they were such a curious people. And they were curious because culturally at that time, that's what they did. They loved to talk about the newest ideas and the latest things in philosophy. That was what they did as a culture. So they bring Paul up there, and they're like, okay, give us what you got. Help us to understand what it is that you have to say. So Paul now has this huge opportunity because these people are a willing audience questioning him about the things of God, and now he has the opportunity to tell them the good news. So we're going to read in Acts chapter 17, and we're going to start in verse 22. It says this: Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and says, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else." So here's Paul in this situation, and he looks around and he observes. He's like, guys, I see that you are super religious. You guys have got this religion thing down. They've got it so down that he understands that, look, you guys are covering all of your bases. You've got all these idols built to all of these gods, and you've even built this idol for the unknown God. They're trying to make sure, listen, we don't know who's all out there, so let's just go ahead and make one for the one we don't know. And that right there, that's the in that Paul uses to speak to this community. He takes that and he says, this unknown God, let me tell you who that is. Let me help you understand. This God that you don't know about is the God who's the maker of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in man-made temples, and he doesn't need anything from us, because he is a God who gives life to humanity. So he's not some God that's sitting up on a shelf that you build a temple around. He's a God who is living and breathing and gives life to humanity. So then we continue reading in verse 26, and it says this: from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. So here, Paul's sharing the gospel, and he helps people to understand that God wants us as people, as humanity, to reach out and find him, because he's not far from us. In fact, he's very close. Now, the significance of what Paul's saying here, in verse 28, the very beginning, he's quoting a philosopher from their culture, from their time. And then at the very end, he quotes another philosopher of their time. So what he's doing is he's taking their popular culture, and he's going, I know you guys understand these concepts, because we've already talked about the fact that you're very religious, so you understand this. Let me help you understand this about the things of God, the one true God. So he uses their culture to help them understand who God is. Now, there's a deeper meaning to that bit about living and breathing and having our being. There's a English Bible scholar. His name is Charles Ellicott, and he helps us understand that each verb in that verse has a completely different meaning. So as Paul's talking, he's giving meaning to these different words. So when he says, in him we live, he's talking about our animal existence, like our physical who we are. Okay? And then he says, in him we breathe. And so what he's saying there is what moves us to action. So the things that we love, the things that we hate, the things that we fear, because those are the things in our world that move us to behave in certain ways. When you love someone, you behave a certain way towards them. You have certain actions that you do because of that. When you hate something, you have those opposite actions. And so he's showing that these things that move us to action, those are the things that God gives us. In him we live, in him we breathe. And then he says we have our being. And with that one, he's talking about our intellect, our will. And so that's basically the essence of who we are individually as people. And so in all of that, what he's saying is God is so near to us as humans that in every single fiber of who we are, it is in him. He gives us as a people our identity. And that's a pretty cool concept. Over Christmas vacation, I went to visit St. Augustine. I had never been there before, so I got to visit downtown, and it was a lot of fun. I decided that I wanted to go to church on Christmas morning, so I went to the cathedral that's down there. It's, I think it's the oldest Catholic church in our country. So I was like, awesome, I'm going to go get to worship. It's very cool. So I went to morning mass on Christmas morning, and it was really cool because the priest that was there, he was preaching a sermon, and it was coming from the book of John. And what he was focusing on was talking about the importance of words in regards to God and how he relates to us. And so he talked about the book of John, which starts off by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he's talking about how the Word is so important because that's who God is. That was how he helped communicate to us his love and the fact that Jesus came down to earth for us. So he drew that picture, and then he took us to the Old Testament, and he referenced the prophet Elijah. Now, the prophet Elijah had this encounter with God where they're having this kind of conversation, and in that, there was this huge blast of wind that Elijah witnessed. And then there was this huge, massive earthquake that he witnessed. And in those things, God was not in that. And then there was this massive fire, and God was not in that fire. Now, we know a little bit about natural disasters like that. We know what it looks like to survive a great blast of wind, or an earthquake, or great fires. My brother would tell me, he lives in LA, that he would wake up in the morning and his balcony would be covered with ash because of the fires that were raging in California. So we understand how great those acts can be, and yet God was not in that. Scripture tells us that in that encounter with Elijah, God came in a gentle whisper. Because that was how he communicated. He used words to have that communication with Elijah. And then the priest took us all the way back to Genesis, and he said, words are so important in our communication with God because in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, when he created, he used the words, he spoke, and he said, let there be. Exactly. He used his words. And so the fact that God, throughout history, used words to communicate such great things to us is hugely important. And we can take that and understand that Paul, he figures, well, if God can use words to do that, then I'm going to use my words to communicate to the people of Athens who God is. So Paul used these words and the nuances and the different verbiage so that people could understand that in God, we have who we are. We have our identity, and we can center that around him. We can understand that God is not some idol that we put on a shelf because he's so near to us. He's so close to us that he makes us who we are. He's central to our identity. Now, in that last bit, in verse 28, he mentions that we are his offspring. Now, that reminds me of some of my favorite stories because I am an English minor from college. And so I loved studying and reading all that. I'm a total book nerd, so I could just sit in a corner and read for hours. It's one of my favorite things. So what I loved about being in school is that I got assigned to read the things that I loved anyway. And one of my favorites, which I know is a little bit cliche, is Jane Austen, because she's the one who writes all these great romance novels, and I love that. Now, one of my favorite stories is the story of Pride and Prejudice, and I love it in book form, movie form, doesn't matter. I've watched it over 9,000 times. My dad makes fun of me. I mean, it's so bad. There was one time I was sitting at home, and I watched the whole movie, and I was like, man, that was really good. And then I just put it on again and watched it again. I was like, I just like this story. So I love the story of Pride and Prejudice. And I love the idea of period piece dramas because there's so much story in the dialogue. It doesn't hurt that they have British accents either. It keeps it interesting. It's super fun. But in the story of Pride and Prejudice, you have this classic tale of Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. Now, in this story, you have the typical romance where it's like boy meets girl, and boy is kind of like, I would like you, but your family's crazy, you're poor, you have no social status, and you are super opinionated. Like, she lets nothing back. So he's like, I don't know about that. And then you have the girl who's like, I would like you, but you're kind of rich and snobby and entitled and aloof. And so, yeah, that's just not for me. So you have these two people that's kind of going back and forth, and there's all this romantic tension. But here's what happens. In one scene of the story, word gets around to the community that Mr. Darcy is engaged to Elizabeth Bennet. Now, Mr. Darcy had this aunt, and she was very rich and powerful, and she was kind of high and mighty sitting on a hill, and she did her thing, and she held court for the community, and everybody knew you do not mess with this lady, okay? So she gets wind that Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth are engaged, and she is like, oh no, I am not having it. So she gets in her horse and carriage and all that kind of stuff, because there was no FaceTiming in the middle of the night back then. So she gets in her horse and carriage, and she travels all the way to Elizabeth's house and knocks on the door, and she interrupts their entire evening, and she's like, I need to talk to you. So she interrupts their evening, and Elizabeth goes out to talk to her, and this lady proceeds to completely demean and diminish her. I mean, she tears her to pieces. She talks about how there is just no way, it's just completely incomprehensible that Elizabeth can be with Mr. Darcy, because you have no social status, you mean nothing, you're nothing but a peon, and no one in the family would accept her if she chose to be with him. Okay, so now social status and all these connections were huge in this day and age. So it was really important that all of that mattered. So she goes on and she tells her that your name means nothing. You will never be enough because of your social status. Now the reason I like this scene is because of Elizabeth's response. Now what she says is, Mr. Darcy is a gentleman, and I am a gentleman's daughter. So as far as I'm concerned, we're equals. So she completely levels the playing field, and here comes this aunt and all of her bluster and everything like that. And Elizabeth is like, no. See, I know who I am. I am the daughter of a gentleman. And so there's no social discrepancy because I know who I am. And I love that because it reminds me so much of the fact that as offspring, as people of God, we have the ability to have that same exact confidence that she had to level the playing field and to completely walk in knowing who we are. Because Elizabeth Bennet, she completely did her life knowing and behaving and acting as if she's the daughter of a gentleman. She walked in that, she behaved in that, and that was how she lived her life. And we too have the opportunity to do that. She knew who she was and where she came from, and we know who we are and where we come from as well. So here's my point in all of that. If we know that we are God's offspring, then we have this opportunity to truly believe that we know that's true. So if Paul could stand on a pile of rocks in Athens and proclaim to the community that God and Jesus are central to their identity because in him we live, we breathe, we have our meaning. If he could proclaim that we are God's offspring all the way back then we have the opportunity to pay close attention to that even now. Because God gives us life. He colors our lives with our emotions, our passions, our fears. He gives us, his offspring, the rights and the privileges that are afforded to us because of the fact that we come from him. But what we have to do is remember that we have this responsibility to act as if we believe that's true. We might know it, but our behavior has to reflect the fact that we know that. So my question to us then has to be, is what would our lives look like if we truly lived as if in him we live and breathe and have our meaning, that we are his offspring? That would have to mean that we prioritize him, that we make him the center of our lives. If he truly makes our identity centered around him, then we have the opportunity to prioritize that. So as 2017 comes to a close and 2018 looms over us, that means that if you're putting Christ first, that means you're putting him first in front of your spouse, your kids, your family, in front of yourself, because Christ is at the center of who we are as individuals. That means first and foremost, before anything else, our relationship with him has to matter. That means that everything about who we are as people is oriented around the fact that we know who we are in him. That means that in your relationships, whether it be with your boyfriend or girlfriend, that your relationship with Christ comes first. That means it informs every action and behavior that you have. That means that the decisions that you make come from the fact that you know that Christ is at the center of who you are. So the decisions that you're making are going to reflect that. It means the relationships with your parents, the relationship with your boss, all of the people that you come in contact with, your coworkers, everybody, even the people that frustrate you, Christ is at the center of who you are. That means you reflect that in the way that you act. That means in 2018, when you're planning all the things that you're going to do, when you have your